Section 18. The Xenos Resurgent. Alien Empires of the Second Age of Strife. Like opportunistic vultures, the myriad alien nations, empires, collectives, and confederates long suppressed and brutalized during the Age of Imperium rose up once more upon the shattering of the Imperium's power and authority. As mentioned previously, all attempts for concentrated military endeavor on the part of humanity wavered and fell after the Emperor's death, and thus the Xenos were free to expand and dominate as they chose, with only a divided collection of petty imperiums and local power magnates to deal with. Astartes' support was sporadic and infrequent, and often as damaging to the human forces as they were to the aliens themselves. The Tau, easily the most successful of these Xenos expansionists, have already been touched upon within this tome. However, their realm is but one of countless hundreds of alien communities rising during this dark period, intent upon conquest, slaughter, and in many cases, vengeance. The following are the most important or interesting of these groups. 1. The Quarrel Swarmhood. On the completely arbitrary borders between the Segmentum Pacificus and Obscurus, the Quarrel Empire spread out from Loquits, their sacred homeworld, into the punishing void. This race of insectoids were vicious and violently expansionist. Expansion and victory, these are the only justifications the insane race required for their imperialism. A space-based race, traveling in vast conglomerations of conjoined microcraft, which link together to form colossal chain ships, honeycomb structures of lethal technological power and scale. The entirely male race is short-lived, and those alive have fetishism for their dead ancestors, building upon their works for generations, while the Swarm Queen, the matriarch, mother and leader of all Quarrel, lives on seemingly forever. During the 41st millennium, the Quarrel were nothing but a mild annoyance to the old Imperium due to their lack of warp-capable vessels. Even when they scavenged and reverse-engineered an Imperial warp drive, they still lacked the essential component. They had no navigators to guide them through the Nightmare Realm. However, as the Imperium became more stretched and overwhelmed by the new devourer, the alien insect species took advantage, stealing human navigators from the undefended warp shipping in the area. The Quarrel laid vile mind worms into the central cortex of the navigators, drugging and controlling them. They spread rapidly soon after, pushing their borders out almost 100-fold during the first 2 decades of Millennium 42. However, this expansion was sporadic and not uniform. The Quarrel, fortunately, did not have a system of astropaths to aid communication, and couldn't coordinate as easily as they could travel. But the Quarrel had an advantage in the warp. The Quarrel themselves were not a naturally emotive race, and their species was relatively quiet in the frothing madness of the ether. Even their navigators, drugged and transfixed by the Quarrel, could barely remember being human and near mindlessly navigated the realm of madness, numb to the warp's tendrils. Even when the Emperor died, throwing the warp into ever greater fits of churning lunacy, the Quarrel were relatively unscathed, and navigated the warp in much the same way. Of course, the distances capable by their vessels were cut short by the sudden loss of the Astronomicon. But their insensible navigators could still fumble their way through the shallows of the warp, and so they continued on their expansion. The Quarrel eventually began to meet human worlds who no longer had defensive aid from their precious Imperium. The jubilant scuttling fiends attacked these worlds eagerly. Like a giant ant nest, the Quarrel swarmed over the worlds. Winged warrior Quarrel filled the skies and scuttled across the ground. Their high-tech gas-based weapons, operated by their own biology interfacing with metal devices directly, poisoning and murdering millions of people. Heavier Quarrel descended in microcraft, unleashing heavier weapons. Tanks and armored emplacements were cracked open with their heavy kinetic cannons, and the vile poison gas-based warfare of the other Quarrel seeped into them, killing the defenders with ease. Once broken by the disturbingly organized aliens, Worker Quarrel were unleashed upon the world. Livestock, flora, fauna, building materials, and precious ores, all were pillaged by the regimented lines of workers, guided by the pheromonal and hormonal orders from the unseen commander drones. Once the orbiting chain ships were restocked, the workers would begin seizing humans. The biologically higher-ranking Quarrel would have thousands of humans brought before them, who they would suck dry of blood with their mosquito-like mouth parts. Then, weeks later, the Quarrel would spray all human population centers with a kind of crimson fog of human blood, merged with highly advanced Quarrel pheromones. Soon, the staggering broken human populace, drenched in gory pheromonal fluid spray, began to howl mindless praises to the Quarrel, or the Star Swarm as they became known. Hundreds upon hundreds of human worlds fell and were turned this way, securing Quarrel borders with fanatical human scent slaves. However, several of the petty imperiums bordering the swarmhood have begun to trade with the vile insectoids. Since the loss of the Paternova and the Navis Nobilitae, the navigators have become a dying breed. Some cunning imperiums seized as many navigators as they could, and persuaded them to form communes of navigators within each petty imperium. These three-eyed mutants would be given any indulgence or pleasure they desired. In exchange, the navigators would breed with one another to produce navigator offspring, who would then become state-owned property of the petty imperium to serve on their vessels at the wish of the petty imperium's kings and leaders. The Quarrel, baffled by human biology, failed spectacularly to duplicate this effort, often trying to force two same-gendered navigators to mate, or trying to find the biggest, and hence, to the Quarrel perception, female navigator, and then planting hormones in them in the hope it would produce. The Quarrel were therefore reliant on their human neighbors, who granted them a small tithe of inbred navigators in exchange for their safety from Quarrel assault. At least until the petty imperiums could build up large enough forces to ambush and destroy the vile aliens. And so did the Quarrel come to dominate a vast tract of western galactic space. 2. The Vorlich-Tar Nation Worlds. The Vorlich came perilously close to being devoured by the Tyranids, located as they were in the galactic south. Luckily for them, Kryptman diverted the Tyranid fleet towards Octavius at that point, unknowingly saving their entire race. A feline race, they developed slowly on their worlds. No one is sure how, but 5 different species of Vorlich evolved seemingly independently on the 5 inhabitable worlds within their system. When they sent the first chemical rockets to their fellow system worlds, the culture shock was immense, and the Vorlich races, who had never seen the need to develop ranged weaponry by that point, fought long and bloody campaigns of conquest and war. However, it was upon the 5th world where their destiny changed. The Vorlich upon this world came across long, crashed wreckage. The shifting ethereal runes slithering across every surface made the feline savages realize that this must be a vessel of the gods. In particular, the beautiful images of the great half-serpent god became a focus of their worship and devotion. The sonic weapons they uncovered from the bodies of the giant primate skeletons aboard were seen as a gift by the serpent god to defeat the enemy Vorlich and take their place amongst the void beyond. The 5th planet's scientists took apart the sonic weapons and found out how they functioned, soon producing many more of these weapons. These Vorlich-Tar, as they now called themselves, defeated their foes easily. The giant golden towers of their fellow Vorlich were no match for the dread howl engines and the scream staves of their conquerors, which shattered bastion after bastion. The Vorlich-Tar were, by Millennium 43, united under the 5th planet. The glittering, beautifully carved and sculpted armor of the Vorlich was made in an attempt to emulate their god's ancient armor. It was fully sealed, and their brazen suits covered the whole bodies of the feline warriors of Vorlich. Built into the helms of most Vorlich troopers was a grille from which the built-in howl engine would pulse lethal blasts of noise at their foes, pulverizing bones and organs as the slender, venom-fighting daggers of the aliens hacked apart the survivors in brutally skillful close combat. The leaders of the troops of the Vorlich-Tar wielded staves which fired invisible, narrow wavelength beams of pure sound which blasted apart even battle tanks. Ingeniously, the Vorlich used sonic devices to destabilize the structure of the chemical fuel of their rockets, eventually developing a bizarre form of engine which allowed them to travel across the void of space much more quickly. And so the brazen cohorts of the Vorlich the 5th spread out from their home system. Progress was painfully slow due to the lack of any FTL systems. A chance encounter with the Space Hulk changed this. The witch princes of the 234th cohort, upon encountering the Hulk, began to get visions from the ether, from their gods apparently, telling them that the Hulks moved across space and time freely, allowing the Vorlich to advance swiftly. Eagerly, the cohort fleet investigated the hulk. They found docks big enough to harbor their fleet, and all the twisted monsters on board the ship that could have killed the Vorlich were mysteriously killed before the Vorlich had arrived. Thus, in relative safety, the Vorlich pillaged the hulk of the strange artifacts within, shipping them back to the Vorlich Tar homeworlds. These technologies allowed the Vorlich to advance beyond their system, conquering some of the weaker civilizations directly near them. The feline monsters conquered worlds, building statues of their god and of their greatest heroes across a dozen worlds defeated by them. The Vorlich were arrogant and vain, in emulation of their master. 3. Harud. Across the galaxy, in every dark nook and hidden space, they survived. Their underworld of darkness and cold has hidden between the layers of other civilizations. They fed upon the detritus of other ascendant races and cobbled together a civilization from the cast-offs of the decadent races, the arrogant beings who clung to the light, terrified of the darkness. In the darkness, they watched, waiting and planning, a race both cursed and blessed by their father and God, cursed to skulk in the shadows, to be the shadows, blessed to weather any holocaust, any horror the universe could cast upon them. They were the Harud. The Harud possess innumerable colonies, infesting countless worlds both alien and human, as well as lurking amid ships and millions of vessels across the galaxy. Thus, when the new Devourer slew a third of all life, and the doom of the Imperator claimed trillions more lives, the Harud, though scattered and most certainly affected by the sudden losses of life, were not as devastated as other races. They continued to spread forth from their pits, their warp plasma weapons and scavenged technologies making them formidable opponents. Oddly, however, Harud infestations seem to get less frequent during this period, but many suspect the Harud are abandoning their lesser colonies and outposts, as if drawing together their collective strength. For what purposes? Again, a mystery. Strangely, wherever the so-called penumbra phenomenon are located, most witnesses claim that the Bendies were somehow helping them. Of course, humanity being ignorant as it is likely that terrified humans merely mistook an Umbra attack for a Harud one, as both make use of shadows to attack. Where once whole Imperial Crusades and Astartes task forces were assembled to clear out the largest Harud infestations, the fractured galaxy of the Second Age of Strife could not hope to do this. The petty Imperiums were either too weak or self-interested to aid their beleaguered rivals, and the few remaining interstellar, old Imperial forces were scant and had greater concerns to worry about. Thus, the Harud Empire was allowed to fester, and the Harud to grow in numbers and power. In some of the most isolated human colonies, the surface-dwelling humans merely became a cowed and insensible horde of virtual slaves as the Harud took an annual tithe of the people, snatching them and dragging them below to work the mines and factories deep in the darkness. The Harud themselves are shadows made flesh, a field of unlight flowing around them at all times. Their supple and multi-jointed bodies make them fold like shadows. No nook or crack is beyond their reach as the Harud scuttle between the tight, cramped spaces between their vast black halls. According to the slaves, the Harud possess titanic libraries filled with archaic texts and books, made from the only viable parchment material available: human skin. Those humans too tired to continue working are struck down by venom talons and sent to the whirring flaying machines deep below. None of the insane witnesses of these vast Harud libraries knew what was written upon these endless texts. Though, if the stories of the Harud's perfect genetic memories are true, the libraries of the Harud could well be the documented history of the entire galaxy since the creation of the Harud themselves. The Harud have been watching for millennia upon millennia. What untold secrets are they privy to? Some of the most crazed and deluded escaped prisoners claim they had witnessed the center of the great Harud fortresses. The Harud surround a perfectly spherical, black monument, their shadowy forms prostrate before this orb. Others claim the Harud occasionally came to the surface at night, dragging selected slaves with them. There they would meet vast, angular craft, big as cities but silent as whispers. The Harad would enter the mysterious crafts before returning some hours later, forcing the human slaves to lug heavy supplies of food and glinting ornaments and artifacts onto the titanic vessels themselves. Evidently, if these pathetic lunatics are to be believed, the Harad are supplying and aiding another, as yet unknown race. A race potentially yet to reveal its hand. Whoever the Harad worship, in whatever relationship they have to the outside universe, this much is abundantly clear. The Harad are ready. The Harad are waiting. 4. The Thexian Trade Empire. The Thexian Trade Empire began small, encompassing the Borlak, Niskassar, and Loxtel civilizations in their net of interstellar trade. These civilizations prospered and grew, the security of being part of a greater whole stimulating greater interracial exchange and trade. Fear of the human imperium initially drove them together. Then, fear of the new devourer pushed several more races towards alliance, including the water-breathing Actorian, the Nakuli, the soldiers of the Drong War Faith, and even the Grand Oppression Naya of Ka Valamar, a group of almost mindless serpentine aliens, entirely ruled by a single group of 5 individuals, who were each oppressed emotionally and conceptually by their fellow leader minds, thus ensuring total blessed oppression. Initially, this grouping was due to mutual fear rather than common cause, and the profits of the Empire sank slightly in the early years directly post-Imperator death. Eventually, though, through the manipulation and subterfuge of the Thexian elite, they became the rulers of Thex Prime, and unofficial leaders of the entire trade empire. Before the Thexian elite arose amongst the Thexians, the race was nothing. They were confined to their blood moons, red and dusty planets with few resources. One day, many centuries before the Second Age of Strife, the Thexian elites began to appear within Thexian society, working their way into positions of power across the blood moons. They were charming and cunning beyond reason. Only one of their multiple forms looked like a Thexian at all. Their battle forms were horrifying to behold as they twisted into snarling bat-like monsters. Nevertheless, the Thexian elite ruled Thex Prime near perfectly, and their monstrous side was only unleashed upon the enemy and criminals. As it soon transpired, the Thexian image of these elites was only a glamour itself, and the bat was the true form. The Thexian elite infiltrated the command positions of all their trade empire's member nations, taking on the shape of whatever race they sought to lead and keeping the peace between the nation civilizations. Under the watchful, sinister gaze of the elite, the empire was driven to new heights. More and more races began to join the Thexians. The most notable and eager of these new races were the human-hating Talarians, who initially began trading with the Actorians, who had developed an artificial gestation technique, allowing the reptilian Talarians to bolster their dwindling numbers with biologically accelerated new Talarians. The troll-like Gron Golem Smiths were another race to eventually join, commissioned by the Empire to produce ships, factories, and commercial fighting vehicles of the finest quality. Soon, this empire of commerce had spread its web across numerous scattered civilizations, both advanced and primitive across the galactic northeast. However, soon the Thexian elite would come into conflict with a rising force, the Tau Empire. The Niskassar were a client race in the Tau Empire by Millennium 41, and by Millennium 42-43, they were almost entirely integrated. However, the Thexians also had massive sway over the nomadic Niskassar Psychers, and soon a dispute arose between the two Xenos empires, with Antalie decrying the Thexians as selfish abusers of the disadvantaged. This was true, as the Thexian elite adopted a policy of survival of the shrewdest, but not the real reason for Tau antagonism. The Thexians offered another route, an option other than the greater good. While the petty Imperiums offered nothing but tyranny and genocide of Xenos, Thexians offered a viable alternative, and the Tau could not accept this. The final straw came in 825, Millennium 45, when a Thexian plot to install Thexian elites into Tau society was uncovered. War was declared within the year. The Tau military machine by that point was awe-inspiring in its advancement and power, as it had been allowed to develop in the absence of imperial control since the fall of the Emperor's realm, and the hideous chaos that engulfed the galaxy. While the Tau had a dedicated army to their empire, the Thexian system, being based around trade and commerce, used its wealth and power to bring in vast forces of mercenaries from across the galaxy. The forces employed by the Thexian elite were diverse and numerous. Ulthian bone-eaters, horrific non-humanoid beasts, paid in the bones of Tau children, Nestronian acid fulgars, strange gaseous creatures contained inside advanced humanoid fighting suits. Of course, Nikoli war parties, Loxtal warriors, and whole churches of drawing war monks of the war faith, singing praises to their gods of battle as they killed with their holy shatter cannons, were enticed into the war, for their people were already part of the trade empire. In addition to these, whole battalions of serf soldiers were purchased from far-flung Krieg. The backbone to these vast forces of mercenaries were the Talarian soldiers, which had become a vast and professional army, loyal to the Actorians who were in turn loyal to the Thexian elites. These armies either equipped themselves or were equipped by the Gron Golem, and were eager for slaughter and profit. Arrayed against them were over 17 50th Spear expedition fleets of Tau commanded by Commander Moonblade, an infamous commander, known to be brutal amongst the Tau, offering worlds the choice of death or conversion to the greater good, and giving worlds only a few hours to choose before bombing and invading soon after. Massive numbers of Vespid sting wings, several Demiurg brotherhoods, Guevesa and Husta armies of human subjects, and the League of the Avan, strange translucent aliens with advanced laser technology, formed additional auxiliary wings of this vast force. Kroots, as ever, hired themselves out to both sides during the conflict, much to the annoyance of the Tau. The situation in the far galactic east, in the wake of the New Devourer, was particularly bad. Where the eastern fringe was once teeming with life, now 4 out of every 5 previously inhabited worlds were left as barren husks. Often, it was upon these husks that the brutal and bloody battles between the Thexians and Tau were fought. No mercy was offered, and terrible things were done by both sides. Biological warfare, orbital assaults, firebombings, nuclear weapons, virus and retroviruses, all were used at some point in addition to conventional warfare. Massive alien fleets tussled in the void, as armies of multitudes battled fiercely across balls of rock. The Tau fought with the bitterness of a child inheriting a ruined legacy, and the Thexian side fought with greed and reckless, murderous pride. Due to the small amount of humans involved directly in the war, the petty Imperiums barely realized how massive the Thexian-Tau war truly was. It lasted well into the 46th millennium, and claimed billions of lives, especially when the noisome Reek joined the war on the Thexian elite's side. Before the Thexian Trade Empire and Tau Empire agreed to a demilitarized area of space between them, which they were forbidden to cross. This peace, however, was meaningless. In the Second Age of Strife, peace was, at best, a miscalculation, and at worst, a blatant lie. Unemployed mercenaries continued to murder and pillage post-war. Blood and pain are the only currency that truly mean anything in this period.